Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 262. Embellishments in the Sherlockian Spring.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes, where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready to embellish a little bit?
I'm absolutely ready to embellish. Yes.
When are you not?
That's a very good question. When am I not embellishing? That's a very good question.
Oh boy. Well, it's interesting. We have chosen this particular episode to follow a quote from one of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And I think we had Nick Utekin on a few years ago. We were talking about, was there something we talked about, embellishments? Was that one of his, I don't know if that was one of his books or not.
Oh, occasionally to embellish.
Occasionally to embellish, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So, but we are not embellishing occasionally here. This is actually from a quote in the Naval Treaty. Remember that great scene where Sherlock Holmes is standing up there and is admiring the moss rose, and he said, "Our highest assurance of the goodness of Providence seems to me to rest in the flowers. All other things, our powers, our desires, our food, are all really necessary for our existence in the first instance. But this rose is an extra. Its smell and its color are an embellishment of life, not a condition of it. It is only goodness which gives extras. And so I say again that we have much to hope for from the flowers." And isn't it lovely to think of our little pastime, our little hobby, what we do in the Sherlockian world, as an embellishment of life? Not a necessity. It's an extra. And there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, and as you say, that is the approach that we're taking today. We thought we would pause for a moment because it's the spring, and it's a perfect opportunity to look at the things that are blooming all over the place. And there's plenty blooming in the Sherlockian world.
There sure is. And this is going to be an odd show, one where we don't have an interview guest. And I know you're all probably shutting off your podcast devices now, shutting us down, because it's just me and Bert.
Oh, I am too. Yeah, bye.
Okay, so it's just me. This should be fun. But I mean, I think it's nice to have a show like this every once in a while. That we are, I guess the constant throughout all of our 262 shows to date. We are the ones that appear here. Our guests are some repeat guests, as you heard, with Andy Solberg and Bob Katz in the last episode. And they had some lovely words of encouragement and of gratitude for us, which I was really touched by. We have those available as an extra for those of you who are supporters via Patreon. So if you'd like to get in on that, simply go to patreon.com/IHearOfSherlock, or it's available in the show notes here, and become a patron. And you too can listen to these extras, bonus clips and outtakes and all the rest. But Andy and Bob had some kind words about the longevity and the, inextricability of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere as part of the Sherlockian hobby. So, and if you'd like the full show notes, because we're going to be referencing other material, we're going to be referencing other shows, etc., the show notes are available at ihose.co/ihose262. All lowercase, just type that into your browser or click on the link in the podcast listening service, wherever you happen to be listening to us right now, ihose.co/ihose262. That'll take you to our webpage. Of course, you can sign up for updates, email updates, and the rest, and follow us to our Patreon page there as well, and click on all of the links that go to our social media sections. We're going to be talking specifically about one of our Facebook groups, where we have a regular presence there, active discussion. It's a wonderful community, and I consider it an outgrowth of the community of listeners that we have here. So you'll want to get a link for that as well. So that being said, let's get on with the show.
Oh, good idea.
So in throwing this episode together, and I do not use that term, that phrase lightly, I was inspired by the latest gas lamp in the Baker Street Journal, the Winter 2022 edition. This is the final volume, the final number that Steve Rothman is appearing in as an editor. He will heretofore be editor emeritus when Dan Andriacco takes over with the Spring 2023 edition. But Steve had a lovely gas lamp, and he always writes very thoughtful gas lamps, and they have largely followed a very similar theme, and they have been about Sherlockians. And I think that's always resonated with me in particular because, yes, any single one of us can fall down a rabbit hole of scholarship, of reading the stories, of analyzing them ourselves. But it's really in this gathering of minds, this curiosity, the gregariousness, even though many of us are introverts, that bring Sherlockians together and make the Sherlockian world what it is. I wondered what your impressions of that are.
Impressions of what?
Just the Sherlockian world, and you know how we see time and again that it's the people that bring it all together, not just the words on a page.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The cases of Holmes and Watson and the characters of Holmes and Watson are touchstones and magnets that bring people together because they happen to have this common interest. And it also gives people something to talk about. But Steve says it very well in the editor's gas lamp that you refer to in the Winter 2022 Baker Street Journal. He says, more than any other topic, I've used this space to hammer my message that the greatest strength of the Sherlockian movement is not the detective or the mysteries, but the friendship between Holmes and Watson. And to this end, I've applauded and scolded and held up countless examples, but I've implored readers to welcome others to Baker Street and to always remember that Holmes and Watson give us an example of the finest of friendships. And for me, the Sherlockian, occasionally people ask me, who know nothing about this, and you tell them you're interested in Sherlock Holmes. And the next question is usually, well, what do you do? and you talk about the gatherings and so on and so forth. And then for people who are still, mystified, the next question tends to be generally the equivalent of, well, what do you get out of all of that? And what I get out of all of that is my friends. I mean, there are people, unfortunately, that I only see at Sherlockian gatherings, but that, for me anyway, is an excuse, a motivator, to go to more Sherlockian gatherings. And that's just part of, frankly, for me, it's just part of the thrill. I was so pleased to go to my first meeting of the Red Circle very recently, and saw some people who, frankly, I haven't seen in a long while, and some people that I had seen relatively recently, but I got a chance to continue some conversations with them. And it's the more research that you do, we mention this from time to time, but the more you look at what constitutes thriving and happy societies, there's a very strong social component and there's a very strong community component. And particularly as you age, maintaining those connections, having friendships, is directly connected to personal happiness and longevity, and it's not surprising. So the friendships are really fundamental. And you've just talked recently, I think, about the friendship between Holmes and Watson, and that's just a lovely defining characteristic of the world of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, I mean, the comment there about community and happiness, I think that's a really important one. And to me, Sherlockians, and for those who are newer to the hobby, it may seem like a strange place. It may seem like it might be difficult to know where to get started. I mean, now in 2023, there is so much information out there. There are so many sources from which to gather scholarship and clubs, both online and offline, traditional and non-traditional, etc. It can be difficult to know where to start. And we did some episodes early on, I think, in the history of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, going back to season 1, I believe. I think we did Sherlockian 101, episodes 4 and 5. We'll have links to those in the show notes, where we kind of bring you through the process and help you get started. And even since then, that was back in 2007. So, I mean, we're talking, 16 years ago now from those first episodes. Stuff has changed since then. And yet, I'll tell you what hasn't changed, and that is the esprit de corps of the Sherlockian movement, the willingness to welcome in new members, to make people who are attending maybe their very first meeting feel as if they are members of a family. And these gatherings that we do, whether they're every month, every quarter, every year, every 3 years in some cases, they are like a family reunion, but they're with a family that you love seeing. And that's the difference. I think when we go to these, we have, you've got your favorite uncle, you've got your, your kooky cousin, people that you love to seek out and spend time with. And I think, and we've talked about this before as well, we end up meeting new people. Hey, Bert, here, would you come over here and meet so-and-so? I've just met them for the first time. I think you'd be interested. And then here's the real interesting part. The magic that happens is you find out what else these people are interested in, because the what else, to me, is the added bonus of all these Sherlockians, that you've got Sherlockians who are Trekkies. You've got Sherlockians who are Broadway musical aficionados and opera buffs and on and on and on. And it just creates such a rich experience for everyone who's involved.
Absolutely. And it's a lovely thing that the Baker Street Irregulars have formalized that in a way with the creation of a mentoring award, which was just, if I remember correctly, I think Peter just won the first mentoring honor at the
That was last year.
That was last year, yeah.
That was the Susan Rice Award.
Right, Susan. Susan was just, and we've had Susan on the show happily, and she's a dear friend who's much missed. And she was renowned for welcoming new people and connecting them. It's more than just welcoming people, but it's making sure they understand, making sure they feel comfortable, introducing them to other people. And giving them things, if you have 2 copies of something. And the whole Sherlockian world is full of those sorts of anecdotes. I remember that Glenn Moranker, when we talked to him about his first experiences with Sherlockian collecting, had lovely stories about Dan Poznansky, the great collector, our friend in Boston, who, among other things, showed up at his house one day with a carton full of books and said, you need these. And it's just part of the great spirit here. So what we thought we would do. So what we thought we would do today.
Before you go on, though, I want to make sure we do make sure people know you can listen to Susan Rice on episode 61, where she joined us with Ray Betzner to talk about the legendary Vincent Sterrett, and then she joined us again on episode 89 with Evie Herzog to talk about the whole history of the adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, which is a wonderful retelling of their early days. And I want to make sure I've got my references correct here, because we did mention that Peter Blau was the first recipient of the Susan Rice Award in 2022, and I think he was given that award with or by Curtis Armstrong, who was a longtime mentee of Susan Rice from their Detroit days, believe it or not. But this time around, if I can find it here, it went to... Well, now, wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
Now, this isn't right. I thought there was another one.
No, I don't think so.
Maybe it was announced last year. Maybe that's what I'm remembering.
I think that's the thing. Yeah, Peter is the first recipient, I believe.
What was presented by Curtis last year? Huh. Maybe it was the announcement of it. Maybe it was just the announcement of it.
Seems like an opportunity for a little editing here.
Yeah. Could be. Could be outtakes. But anyway.
Spool this onto the outtake reel.
I wanted to mention, I had actually written an intro to a wonderful reminiscence of Susan Rice. Because, and let's just want to make it clear to our listeners here, this is not a tangent. It may seem like we're getting off on a tangent, but it's not. Because when you talk about embellishments in Sherlockian springtime, that is Susan. First of all, she loved bees, right? and her investiture was bee swing. And when you think about what bees do, they are very social creatures. I was going to say they're social butterflies, but they're not. They're bees. But they go from flower to flower, and they pollinate, and they introduce new things and new individuals to one another. And Susan was so welcoming. And when we remembered her on the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere website in 2020, after she passed away, the outpouring was indicative of that. There were a number of people who wrote their own personal reminiscences of Susan, and we edited them together. But the introduction is that, Susan Rice, and she was a New Yorker as well. Susan Rice might be best remembered as the Lady Liberty of the Sherlockian movement, welcoming everyone, regardless of how they came to Holmes, what their interests are, or any other aspect of their lives. Susan made her home in New York City, lifting her lamp beside a golden door to Sherlockian circles, offering a warm welcome to anyone who wished to enter. And if we remember that poem, she could be considered a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows the worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame.
Yes. Wow.
Emma Lazarus would be proud.
Yes.
But the if you don't yet have a copy of the Winter 2022 Baker Street Journal, now would be a great time to make sure you get one. I don't know if they're still available. It's a good question. We might have an extra one. But Steve Rothman's final gas lamp is just a wonderful summation of what he did and what he stood for. And interestingly enough, Steve says that my earliest gas lamps were untitled, but that didn't last long. By the autumn 2002 issue, I started looking for lines from songs, at least in my mind, that related to the topic under discussion. Only the late Susan Rice let me know that she recognized my game. It's actually not true. I let him know at one point, too. I figured it out. It was well after Susan, though, I'm sure. Steve continues, the song sources range from Tin Pan Alley, Button Up Your Overcoat, to David Bowie, Changes, with a stop at the Disney Beauty and the Beast, Belle, and a great many nods to the Beatles. For instance, the autumn 2019 Mad About the Boy was lifted from Noel Coward's song of that name. An editorial was an appreciation of Watson. The gas lamp you are reading, and it is titled, I Leave and Heave a Sigh and Say Goodbye, takes its title from The Sound of Music, and its coda from the only musical I have tried to use sparingly, Baker Street. And if you're curious as to the coda that Steve mentions, he says, I'm not going anywhere. You may see my byline here or elsewhere. You'll certainly see me at Sherlockian events. Please come up and say hello so I can thank you. And please remember that the canon truly is, in Christopher Morley's words, a textbook of friendship. I shall miss you, Holmes. Well, our friends at MX Publishing continue to churn out some amazing work. The MX book of new Sherlock Holmes stories is now up to part 36. And this set is called However Improbable. And there are 58 new Sherlock Holmes adventures collected in 3 companion volumes. And remember, the MX book of new Sherlock Holmes stories began as a project in 2015. And it featured traditional canonical adventures set within the canonical time period. And it's written by many of today's leading authors. And the new volume is continuing on the tradition of the multi-volume sets. In 2017, there was Eliminate the Impossible, a 2-volume set. In 2019, there was a 3-volume set, Whatever Remains Must Be the Truth. And now, of course, we have However Improbable. And in this case, we have tales of Holmes's encounters with seemingly impossible events, ghosts and hauntings and crimes and events that have taken place, but happened. They apparently did. 58 stories in 3 companion volumes. Best new Holmesian and Sherlockian storytelling abounds. Edited by David Markham. Pick up your copy of the latest volume of the MX book of new Sherlock Holmes stories at mxpublishing.com today. All right, well, what do you say we move on to some of the more group-like gatherings that are happening or have happened this spring already?
Well, that's a good idea. Yeah, we thought we would focus this episode on, exactly that. Some of the people and some of the events that are already making spring 2023 quite distinctive. And we can start with the end of March and Holmes, Doyle and Company in Dayton. And I can't remember which number in the series
8.
of these conferences. Oh, this is number 8.
Number
by
8.
The great Agra treasurers. And Dan Andriaco, who is succeeding Steve, as editor of the Baker Street Journal, is the program chairman for Holmes, Doyle and Company. And they've just had a wonderful conference that, like many of the conferences, featured me not in attendance, which is something that I really have to address next year. But it was a terrific program. And, we thought we would take a moment and start, just by reviewing that.
Yeah, and I've had the honor of going to the conference. I don't remember. I think I went there twice so far. And it's a lovely little conference. I mean, Dan and the Agro treasurers do a really nice job at this little airport inn, the Clarion Airport Inn in Dayton. It's very cozy and very informal. It's kind of just informal sandwiches the evening before, and just a warm, welcoming environment for people who are just rolling in or flying in. And then really the conference is kicked off in seriousness on Saturday morning with breakfast and vendors' tables, etc., and right into a big welcome and the talks. And as you know, when you ask Sherlockians to show up and talk about their particular subject of interest, you can almost cut the excitement and cut the passion with a knife, because these are people that bring their whole selves to their presentations. And our friend Johanna Draper Carlson was actually kicking off the program this year, talking about Sherlock Holmes comics. What else? Right? We had Johanna on the show last year to talk with us about Sherlock Holmes in the comics, and she that was episode 239 in season 16. And we saw her at the BSI weekend as well, and she's doing a wonderful job with the Sherlock Holmes in Comics.com website. Got a chance to go through the history of Sherlock Holmes in comics and bring everyone at the conference along for a ride.
Yes, and she was followed on the program by Terence Faherty, and Terence is someone, too, that we've spoken to on this podcast. And he discussed the top 10 reasons to love the universal Sherlock Holmes. I'm sorry that I wasn't there to hear that. That must have been great.
Yeah, and Terence has done a great job with the True Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, kind of a comedy, fanciful book about what actually went on behind the scenes. So you can imagine the fun that was had there. And Denny Dobry, another guest on the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere show. We talked with Denny Dobry about his wonderful collection of, it's a recreation of 221B Baker Street in episode 153. He talked about one very specific element. And Bert, you're associated with this as well, the Penang lawyer.
Yeah, Denny has, of course, certainly the best recreation of the sitting room on the East Coast, certainly, if not larger. And one of the things he and I have talked about is the Penang lawyer. The Penang lawyer is, of course, the walking stick that Dr. Mortimer left behind at 221B Baker Street in The Hound of the Baskervilles. And it's that wonderful scene, too, where the story opens and Holmes has in front of him a well-polished, silver-plated coffee pot. And he sees in the reflection on the coffee pot Watson looking at this stick that was left behind. And he says, "Well, Watson, what do you make of it?" And Watson, of course, thinks he has eyes in the back of his head. And Denny is quite expert in many things, and among them is the actual history and the Constitution and the location of the Penang lawyer, where it came from, where it was manufactured, what it is. And in the course of assembling his sitting room, has always had a wonderful example of the Penang lawyer left behind by Dr. Mortimer. And it's a wonderful walking stick. It's based, well, I won't tell you any more about it. If you're really interested, you could look it up online and see some descriptions, I'm sure, of the Penang lawyer. But I'm sure Denny spoke about, because of his topic here, the Penang lawyer in the movies. I doubt that there ever was a movie that accurately showed what the Penang lawyer looks like. And indeed, many of the illustrations, with the exception of Paget, I think, many of the illustrations of that particular scene and that particular walking stick are inaccurate.
Well, I know my Penang lawyer is about 5'7", wears glasses, and is impeccably well dressed.
And it's up for parole soon, isn't he?
Yeah. Oh, well, we won't go through the whole program there, but suffice it to say, it was an interesting lineup, a very wide variety of presentations. Jim Hawkins talking about John Bennett Shaw, David McGregor talking about writing Sherlock Holmes plays. David's been with us on many, many episodes, talking about his wonderful contributions to the stage. So, and there will be a Holmes, Doyle, and Friends 9 in 2024. We'll have a link to the Agra Treasurer's website so you can see that. But speaking of growing numbers in anniversaries, 221 Beacon is coming up. And I believe it's happening.
Well, when you hear this, when our listeners hear
it will be happening.
It'd be in the middle of it, yeah.
Exactly. We are recording it before 221 Beacon, but I believe it is April 14th through 16th. So we are smack in the middle of it when this airs. This is the 10th anniversary of this wonderful and widely attended Sherlockian conference. It happens down in Atlanta, and our friends Heather and Crystal have been, well, they put it together and have been masterminding it for this entire time. They joined us here on episode 163 to talk about that. So perhaps if you are at the con and you're on your way back, you want to pop that in as a kind of a retroactive reminiscence of sorts, so you can listen to everything about the origins of 221 Beacon worship.
It's a great program featuring everything from screenings. I'm not going to tell you what's going to be screened, but there's a movie screening, at least one, that's a lot of fun. And you can enjoy sessions like you are enjoying sessions about queer interpretations of Holmes and Watson. There's a speed friending part of the program. There's costuming on a budget. Boy, I'm sorry, I'm going to miss that. And a Pokemon Go meetup.
Wow.
And the worst Sherlock, a costume exhibition. Free at Last, Holmes in the Public Domain, the Dracula Daily, Dickens December, and Letters from Watson, pastiche popularity, and I love this, Wednesday Addams, Goth Sherlock Holmes, ? And a program on young Sherlock Holmes, Holmes through the years, just fabulous.
I love that. And if there was a single event that represents the phrase "all Holmes is good Holmes," this is it. This is the one.
Yep. 10th anniversary.
10th anniversary. Well, let's flip the script a little bit and mention a couple of upcoming meetings. And again, this is not comprehensive. We know there are lots of Sherlockian organizations out there that are meeting and greeting and eating and doing all kinds of fun things. And it is just a great time to be part of the Sherlock Holmes hobby. But there are two that are worth mentioning now that are on the other end of the spectrum from 221 Beacon. And the first coming up is the Sons of the Copper Beeches. This is your one of your home organizations. I'm not a full-fledged member yet.
No.
What's the first stage? Journeyman? Is that
Journeyman, right? And then you become a master copper beechsmith.
Yes, I'm just a journeyman at this point. I haven't been to enough meetings and done all of the work, but I'll get there someday.
But tending is a big part of it.
Yes. You do have to be there.
Being there, yeah, it'd be pretty good. Not much more. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
But this is in Philadelphia, right?
Yes. It is, as it is said, a venerable science society. And looking back at our podcast in episode 18, all the way back in March of 2008, we did a program with some audio featuring the fellow who was at the time the head mastiff of the Copper Beeches, talking about the history of the Scion. Today, Ross Davies has succeeded Bob Katz, and Ross is in the chair as head mastiff with a terrific team of folks who are putting together the program. But you can go back and listen to episode 18 about the Sons of the Copper Beeches, and it's going to be, I think, this is a milestone.
Yeah.
This is the 75th anniversary, I think.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the few to have been around since the 1940s. It's lovely to see. Well, another one in that category, another venerable institution, is the Speckled Band of Boston. And the reason I mention the Speckled Band is because this is the first time the band is going to meet since 2019. Of course, the pandemic knocked out a few of the years for us, and we weren't exactly ready to be back in action last spring because of some health concerns, particularly of a few of our members, and thought it reasonable to delay it to this year. And unlike the Sons of the Copper Beeches, which meets twice a year, the Speckled Band only meets once a year. And that once happens in the springtime. So that's why the timing has been generally unkind to us with respect to the pandemic. However, you can rest assured that once again, the Speckled Band will pick up where it left off and will continue its tradition of toasts and steak and kidney pie and being served champagne directly from the Sherlock Holmes bowl by the keeper. Wonderful traditions like that. And we did do a show about the Speckled Band on the occasion of its 75th anniversary in season 9. We talked with Dan Poznansky in episode 77. We'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. We're just giving you so much more material from our archives to go back and listen to and refamiliarize yourself with these embellishments of Sherlockian, well, not just spring, but of the Sherlockian movement over time.
What was Conan Doyle really like? Thanks to American journalists, now we know. And you can know too when you get your copy of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the newspapers, Volume 6, just published in January. Volume 6 covers the first month of Conan Doyle's tour of the United States in October 1894. Just 4 weeks, but it produced 230 pages of articles, interviews, reports from his lectures, and much more. And because of American interviewers, it's the first time we get really close to Conan Doyle the man. They tell us what he looks like, his way of moving and talking, and all those little things that form a three-dimensional image of the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Get your copy of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the newspapers, Volume 6, edited and annotated by Matthias Bostrom and Mark Halberstadt at wessexpress.com today.
All right, well, let's move on to the final portion of our program. We're going to talk about some interesting people and some of the things they've done in the Sherlockian world in recent weeks and months that are particularly interesting to us. Why don't we start out with our friend Kelly Hodges? Kelly is Kelly is a recent discoverer of the Sherlockian world. She's been an avid consumer of Sherlockian stories, as far as I can tell, and in particular has been an avid consumer of our material. which I take to be, as the greatest compliment, ultimately. But she did actually produce a promo for us. We didn't ask her for it. She produced a promo for us for our other podcast, Trifles, and we played it in the last episode, and it was received with such mirth and humor and everything that it was intended. We thought it was worth listening to again. So, Kelly, take it away.
Friends, do you not have enough murder, mystery, and minutia in your life? Do you find yourself awake at night questioning the true dates of events? Do you crave the mental exaltation of the pursuit of the trivial? Then you need to try Trifles! In the time that it takes for you to commute to work, walk the dog, fold the laundry, or sit and stare at the wall while putting it off, you could be listening to the bite-sized pursuits of knowledge and further details of the world of Sherlock Holmes and beyond. Side effects may include binge listening, unintentionally walking your dog for longer than necessary while binge listening, laughter and intrigue, a renewed interest in Beethoven. All of these side effects can, of course, be countered with a dose of brandy. So, why wait? Treat your ears to the dulcet tones of this podcast. Listen and subscribe to Trifles today.
You know, I particularly like how she got the echo effect in there, like you always used to do.
Yeah. Yes, yes. Fabulous.
Clearly a devotee of our work. Well, thank you, Kelly, for that. Really creative, and we love hearing from our listeners like that. Another person who has clearly taken us to heart is Eric Deckers. You probably have heard Eric's name in, I don't know, just about every episode from the last few seasons, because Eric is a master guesser of the Canonical Couplet, and his guesses put Bert to shame.
Which is easy to do, actually.
I was going to say. I'll leave that to you. But Eric's guesses are always creative, usually a wonderful play on words. Eric is a writer by trade, and he actually has a comedy column called The Laughing Stalk, and has written, at least one novel. I'm not sure if he's written more than one. And Eric, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but his one book that I am familiar with is Mackinac Island Nation, which everybody should go out and buy a copy of right now. His wife wants to be queen of Mackinac Island. Canada is conspiring against him. Russia is invading, and North Korea is looking to buy real estate, all for the wrong reasons. Where does Pete even begin? For those of you who don't know, Mackinac Island is a little island up off the tip of the lower peninsula of Michigan, in between the upper and lower peninsulas. And it is only accessible by ferry and has very few year-round residents. There are no cars allowed on the island. It's where the Grand Hotel is located. And in Eric's book, residents of Mackinac Island find a 200-year-old treaty and discover that they're going to be ejected from the Union if they don't reverse the process in 2 weeks. And suddenly, Pete Bidwell is made the reluctant president of Mackinac Island. He just wants to keep everyone happy and return them to America's warm embrace, and then he's dealing with Canadians, Russians, North Koreans, and all the rest. Eric does a really good job of taking a fun and improbable instance and turning it into a wonderful story. I also wanted to mention Madeline Quinones. Madeline, you've heard her voicemails here before. She's a wonderful fan of the show. Yes, she has her...
Yeah. We had an opportunity to meet Madeline in January.
We did. And she's another Michigander. How about that? She has her own podcast called The Dynamics of a Podcast. And that's all about Moriarty. And she also has I guess it's a weekly audio contribution to the Watsonian Weekly, which is a podcast hosted by Brad Kefauver. And she does a thing on there called the Wondering About Watson. That's her beat. And she has 5 questions, and she interviews people and asks them the same 5 questions every time. And it's a wonderful exposure to different Sherlockians and to how different Sherlockians think. And she goes everything from who's your favorite Watson, which actor would you like to see play Watson, what's your favorite Watson moment in the canon, a favorite line of passage, etc. And if you would like to join the queue and have Madeline interview you for Wondering About Watson on the Watsonian Weekly, we will have a link to the Stranger's Room, where Madeline is collecting interested interviewees.
Well, it's a great question and a great subject. And over the years, many people have made the observation that we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about and writing about Dr. Watson. So I think it's a great great idea. I'll have to get on the list and see, because you've done that. You've been on that podcast.
I was in the March 27th edition of the show. It's the God bless Brad. He creatively titled that episode, I Hear of Watson Everywhere. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. And then finally, speaking of the Stranger's Room, and again, if you're not familiar with the Stranger's Room, it's a group on Facebook. We will have a link to it in the show notes. You can just have to answer a few questions if you'd like to join. I want to make sure we just don't let any random Facebook spam in there. But in the Stranger's Room, Steve Mason, who runs the Beacon Society and has been part of the Legion of Zoom. I think we talked with them. We talked with Rich Kriskunas and Steve Mason back on episode 236. Edith Poundon was there as well. The Legion of Zoom and I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere co-sponsored Holmes Hysteria 2. Now, Bert, are you familiar with March Madness?
Yes. Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
We just got through March Madness, and Steve thought, well, why shouldn't Sherlockians, some of whom may not be interested in sports ball, as it were,
Sports ball.
Why shouldn't they have an opportunity to participate in something similar? So he created Holmes Hysteria, and it's sponsored by the Legion of Zoom and I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And it's basically a fun way to determine which Sherlock Holmes story is the best. And each day there's polling, and he starts out with 4 regional brackets: the Great Salt Lake Regional, the Agra Regional, the Vermissa Valley Regional, and the Devonshire Regional. And he pits stories against each other, and people vote every day. And by the end of the month, we determined which story was the best by popular acclaim. So we won't provide any spoilers here. You can go to the Stranger's Room and search for Holmes Hysteria and see which story came out on top. Do you have any guesses offhand, Bert? I'm not going to give away whether you're right or not, but do you have any guesses as to which Sherlock Holmes story came out on top?
Well, I'm very analytical, so what I would do is go to my gazetteer, my encyclopedia, some of my vast reference materials, and I would look at the word count of the various cases of Sherlock Holmes, because obviously the heavier story is going to win. So the one with more words obviously is going to dominate the field, I would think.
Interesting. I thought you meant the one with Mycroft in it.
Oh, maybe that one too.
Heavier story.
Yeah.
Well, look, everybody's got a favorite, and of course, Arthur Conan Doyle came up with his list of the best Sherlock Holmes stories, and we talked about that. Didn't we do an episode on the best Sherlock Holmes stories? Or was that over on Trifles? I'm getting my podcast mixed up. I think that was on Trifles.
It may have been on Trifles, yeah.
Yeah, it was. It was episode 232 on Trifles. We'll have a link to that if you want to hear our discussion about that, because that was a fun episode as well. But yeah, the Holmes Hysteria 2 has concluded. It'll be back next spring, so look for that as well. I mean, just a lot of great stuff going on right now in the world of Sherlock Holmes and with Sherlockians.
Yeah. Well, in terms of a collection of cases, the return of Sherlock Holmes at 112,610 words is clearly the dominant, and the puniest one is The Sign of Four at only 43,309 words. And A Study in Scarlet has only about 300 more words than that. So A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four as books. Now, you can't really, it's not really fair, of course, because The Return of Sherlock Holmes is a collection of cases. And Study in Scarlet and Sign of Four are more, novellicized. But still, there you are. The dominance of The Return of Sherlock Holmes at 112,000 words looks unbeatable. I have to call Steve and let him know.
Yeah. Well, you check it out and see what you think. But interestingly, the 4 novels that you mentioned there neatly divide themselves into the Great Salt Lake Regional, the Agra Regional, the Vermissa Valley Regional, and the Devonshire Regional.
Oh.
All right. Well, I suppose we don't need to sum ourselves up at this point.
What were these guys thinking?
I know, right? I have no idea what we were thinking. I'll tell you what, why don't we just get ourselves over to everybody's favorite. That's right, it's time for Canonical Couplet, everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and we expect you to come up with which Sherlock Holmes story we were talking about. Well, the last time we were here, we gave you this clue. When a lovely woman to adventure stoops, she turns the wisest of us into dupes. Bert, do you know which Sherlock Holmes story we're talking about?
Oh, of course. That's the great case that Holmes foils a villain by going for a week without eating. And he has a big meal and leaves Watson with the bill. That's the dining detective.
Sorry. That sounds like what happened after that meal. Is that you? No. No, that was not what we were looking for. And once again, Eric Deckers comes to the rescue.
Hooray.
He says, I've solved it, and I think it's most fitting that the prize is a copy of Stimulating Medicine. It's the story of casual footwear that has been stained with unusually high amounts of bile pigment. It's a sandal in hyperbilirubinemia. Actually, I know it's not that. I just wanted to hear Scott say hyperbilirubinemia. It's really a scandal in Bohemia. Well, Eric, you are correct. And I will credit you with, I don't know if you had to look it up or if you just knew from your own medical test, hyperbilirubinemia. But thankfully, I do have a history of medical school in my background, so you didn't catch me completely off guard. I also had 3 days to prepare for this. So, well, let's do this. Let's turn ourselves to the big prize wheel and give it a big spin. It's going around, coming back to land on number 62. 62, and that lands us on Douglas Vaughn. Congratulations. We'll be getting you a copy of Stimulating Medicine, the latest in the BSI Press Profession series. And now, in this case, we have, well, I guess we can give away our copy of Winter 2022 Baker Street Journal with this lovely gas lamp in it from Steve Rothman. Let's get into the clue. The doctor's skill left much to be desired, and nobody was dying, only tired. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment at ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If your correct answer is chosen from all of the other ones at random, you'll win. Good luck. All right, Bert. This is something. Well, thank you for turning on a dime here, or turning on a shilling, whatever we turn on these days, and doing this episode with me. We've had to record this as I've been preparing to get out of town without my equipment. So there's been a little bit of dabbling back and forth, but it worked out pretty well.
Yes, you've been buoyed only by the cheers of your neighbors as they hasten your departure.
Well, we'll kind of keep that quiet so the dog doesn't get too excited.
Well, you have to bear up under it. It happens to me all the time. Every time I pull out of my driveway, great cheers. Every time I drive back home, sad moaning.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, this is the I don't even know what I am right now. The skulking away, Scott Monty.
And I'm the cowering. I'm the cowering down in the basement, Bert Walder.
And together we say the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.